Hi and welcome to History Respawned, Let's Play the Past, Civilization 5. I'm John Harney. So first of all, my apologies if anybody came along earlier. Bob has done this before, I have not. And so I, hilariously or tragically, depending on the point of view, went ahead and recorded about half an hour of content without putting my mic on. So that was great, and why not just share that embarrassing information on the internet? The other problem I had is that I couldn't see comments, so I don't think anybody's viewing right now because nobody's going to come across it yet, but I'll be able to see comments this way too. This is Civilization 5. This series is called Let's Play the Past. For those of you who aren't familiar with who we are, History Respawned is a YouTube account, YouTube channel. We also have a website now, historyrrespawned.com, that once a month shares an interview with an historian about a specific game. So we've done a number of Assassin's Creed games. We've done a section about Bioshock Infinite. We'll return to that game in the future. We have done Dragon Age, The Witcher, and we recently Red Dead Redemption, which Bob and I are both very excited about. And it was Bob's kind of brainchild, and I've come along associated with her as well. And for people who've heard me on podcasts before, you might know that I am an East Asia specialist. And so we had this idea that we would start doing more of these live streams. It's kind of just a goal that we have for the channel as a whole. We know obviously it's a popular thing on YouTube, but to be honest, it's kind of a fun thing to do. So we figured that we'd be able to kind of go through it and to play some games, and the longer strategy is not to stick to stuff that we actually know. The longer strategy is very much to kind of just play whatever game and just talk about it as historians, because one of the kind of features of History Respawned, one of the key interests of History Respawned is not just to talk about whether or not games are historically accurate, because there's some fun to be had there, but to talk very much about the historical process. So as we go on, we're going to start bringing in games that are not tied to what we do. But for my first stream, I decided, I will go ahead and I'm going to do something that I have some kind of basic kind of background in. So we picked Civilization 5 because I can play as China, and I can talk about China. My expertise is actually in 20th century China, but I do a lot of teaching in Imperial China and Imperial Japan. And we have an episode coming up of Civilization 5. I'm really excited about it. We have a very cool guest, but we don't have an ETA on that episode yet because he has requested some time, partly because he's a busy guy, and partly because he plays video games. So not all our guests do. So he wants some time to play some Civ 5. So it sounds to me like an excuse to play Civ 5 and tell his co-workers things for work. So he's our kind of guy. So we're looking forward to that. But in advance of him joining us, I said that we would play a game here. So I'm going to go ahead and pick the map type Earth. I briefly looked into this mod available on Steam Workshop by a person I should say, called Gedemon. And it's, not yet another world map, I think is what he called it. It's fantastic. It's really cool. You start off with your actual kind of logical kind of starting points. Oh, thank you for the note on the game audio. Let me see if I can turn that down. Thanks very much. Thank you for the note. Hopefully that helps. Let me actually check myself here on my second monitor. Sorry for pausing. Yeah, so I'm kind of having trouble here myself with the audio. Why don't I just change that in the menu? Riveting stuff, isn't it? I really appreciate that. I'm kind of new to this. So I'm going to keep this at 35%. Appreciate that. Thank you. Okay. Appreciate the note. Thank you very much, Skepticism. Skepticism, you're great. All right, back to it. So I was saying there's a fantastic mod available called Not Yet Another World Map. It's really good, but I kind of set up my work laptop, and I realized I had two problems, which was that one, I didn't know if my computer could handle it and stream at the same time, because it defaults like 20 civilizations, and I just kind of figured I'd go with the in-game kind of map and kind of stick with it. I did go with huge size though, and warlord level, because I'm a baby gamer. That's a reference for idle thumbs people that might be out there. I'm hilarious. I've been playing Civilization since there's been Civilization. The Civilization 1 was my first Civ game, obviously, but I was like 13 or so, I think, at the time, and I've always played easy. I always have. But I decided that I would also just kind of, because it's live streaming, and if you're here to see somebody skillfully play Civ, I'm afraid to say you're not in the right spot, but my hope is that I can talk about China, and it would be relatively interesting. Went with the game pace to be quick, so that we could kind of get through some of the chaff and not spend too much time kind of hanging around. So let's get into it. So right off the bat, actually, I wanted to talk about this really briefly. Wu Zetian, this is a really interesting choice. Wu Zetian, she was the only empress in the history of the Chinese imperial period. The only female leader China's had, like de facto, as it were. There's a very, very famous woman in the late 19th century in China called Cixi, Cixi. That's how you spell her name. The Empress Dowager Cixi. Sterling Seagrave wrote a very famous book about her called The Dragon Lady. And she's very, very powerful, but all of her power derived from claims to the throne that her son and then her nephew had. She herself wasn't actually empress. Wu Zetian was empress. She was the only woman to ever be, empress of the imperial period. So really interesting choice there by the Civ 5 developers. I mean, to what extent that changes the way the civilization is perceived in the game, I'm not entirely sure. But of all the many, many historical figures, they picked her. Alternative figures might be the Emperor Kangxi, very, very prominent emperor in the late 17th century of the Qing. Emperor Yongle, he's the man who sent out the eunuch Zheng He to travel the world in these massive ships. There are lots and lots of ones there, but they picked Wu Zetian, and she's a pretty cool person, or she was a pretty interesting figure, I should say. Rose from being a concubine to being empress, as it says right here. Recently, I taught a class on history and video games in January, and I had my students play Civilization 5 and had them describe kind of their experience, and in particular how it differed from how the nation they controlled actually kind of, experienced history. And one of the things I wanted them to do was talk about this opening kind of little thing here, this opening little like placard they have that's talking to you about who these people are and everything. So it's kind of an interesting. I think it's a cool little thing. Narration is wonderful, and you see here, the blessings of heaven be upon you, etc., etc. You great queen who'll be cunning with cunning and beauty. Kind of an interesting way of framing things. I think we'll come to that later. This idea of presenting cultural representations are quite interesting in civilization games, I think. Made a couple of little bonuses here, Papermaker and the Chu Konu. So let's go ahead and get started. Are those ruins? They are. Let's send our workers our warriors into the ruins. That's some nice gold. And send our settlers somewhere. Set up a city pretty much as soon as we can get away with. So, no idea where we are yet. There's a river nearby. So where do we start? Well, first of all, the game starts in 4000 BC, which is a long time before you kind of start talking about what I guess we would call civilizations or empires. So I was talking to my class, actually. I'm teaching a couple of classes this semester. I'm teaching Development of the Modern World, which is kind of, the world from the dawn of time until about 1850. And I'm teaching a class called Introduction to Asia. Well, I'm not going to form a city there, am I? With those guys around. And this could be the shortest live stream ever if they kill my settlers. I think that's the end of the game, isn't it? So I've been talking, something tells me the computer has just decided not to, or the CPU has decided not to ruin my game that early. Talk about the origins of Chinese civilizations, and around about now, 3800 BC, there's no evidence of anything, really. There's no proof of anything specific or in particular. Um, what we have is a lot of myth, which of course is by no means unique to China. Um, a few hundred years after this, in the kind of 3200, 3300 BC kind of period, you certainly have what's the person who's known as the Yellow Emperor, who is this mythical, possibly fictional, probably fictional figure who, is kind of the origins of the Chinese state and Chinese culture and all these kinds of things. And all of this stuff becomes very important later on, especially about 3,000 years from the game time here, when you start getting to Confucius and people like that. And for the Chinese, the origins of their civilization is extremely important to them, and it's extremely important to the way that they discuss civilizations and discuss their kind of origins and discuss the nature of Chinese culture. And so it's kind of, they will go on many years later to claim that, yes, like at this time in 3500 BC, there were Chinese lords and kings, and not just that, but that they were very cultured and they had reading and writing and things like that. Speaking of reading and writing, in order to get my research going, I have to actually found a city, and I am not doing a good job here. So I'm just going to set it here on the plains. I usually prefer to have a city kind of near a river or water, but we'll just found it here. There's gold nearby, so that might end up being a good choice. I'm going to change the name to, what will I change it to? To Xi'an, which isn't a lot more historically accurate, but it's a bit more historically accurate. Xi'an was the capital of China in the 3rd century BC under the Qin dynasty. There is no Beijing yet in 3800 BC, and there's no Beijing in 0 AD, and there's no Beijing in 500 AD. Beijing is a city initially founded by the Mongols as Dadu, hundreds and hundreds of years later. And so my tiny little nod to that is to not call the first city Beijing. So when we get to research similar issues, I think that I'm going to try and play this in character as much as I can. Well, I don't know how true that is, but which is to say I'm going to try and get cultural, if not get a cultural victory, certainly kind of try and focus on China being a cultural dynasty for as long as I can get away with. Civ is obviously very famous for becoming kind of a click-heavy micromanagement, kill sim, I suppose, later on. I will try and avoid that as best I can, and I will start off by calling my research on these kind of quasi role-playing kind of lines. So I pick pottery because pottery brings me to writing, and I want to get to writing as soon as I can. So let's go ahead. So I got barbarians here, so kind of early to talk about this, but I suppose it could be brought up. The way the Chinese in the imperial period looked at the world was very much seeing everybody as barbarian, and I'll talk about that more presently. But in their kind of immediate scenario and their kind of immediate issues, they very much had, oh, that's not good, I guess I'll send these guys back home. In their immediate proximities, they had, especially to the north, they had lots of, kind of nomadic tribes, which would fit the kind of stereotypical kind of definition of a quote-unquote barbarian. And in particular, you had this clash between the settled, some more cultured, certainly more static civilization of the Chinese, and the more kind of maneuverable and certainly more kind of not necessarily more warfare based, but based on more on the idea of horseback warfare peoples to the north. And so, for various periods in Chinese history, this has been kind of a big clash that they've been facing, is between them as the kind of this called a cultural outpost versus these barbarians that are near them. Although the Chinese kind of concept of a barbarian, went much further than that, and basically anybody who didn't speak Chinese or didn't read and write Chinese in particular, and who wasn't aware of the Confucian classics, automatically qualified as a barbarian. I'm going to form another warrior, because those barbarians, speaking of, are making me nervous. And I'm going to get a settler as soon as the city, in 4 turns when the city gets bigger, we'll go for a settler. I can adopt a policy. So it's all chugging away here. So one of the fun things of picking the Earth map in Civ is that it'll look a bit like the planet Earth, but it won't. It'll be a complete fluke if we're actually in China. So let's see where it drops us. So adopt a policy. I am going to go with tradition. Why not? I'm going to adopt tradition. A couple options in there that kind of fit my kind of role-playing idea of kind of Chinese historicity. So let's put these guys out here to keep an eye on the barbarians. We'll just let them play sentry there for a while. So, I'm about to go and try and crush some barbarians, which is not necessarily the way that the Chinese dealt with these kinds of threats, especially to the north. Of course, the Chinese are very, very famous for the Great Wall of China, which started out. The Great Wall of China that we know now was built in the very early 15th century. But the Great Wall, kind of its humble beginnings, if you can call them humble, was in the 3rd century BC, and they were basically, to cite Idiazard, a series of small walls built to the north to try and stop, basically Mongols and other types of nomadic tribes coming over the north to kind of fight them. But they could also be very, very pragmatic in how they dealt with barbarians, and so particularly, for example, in the Song period, which is much, much later, in the 10th century AD and later, there are many examples of the Chinese essentially choosing to buy off these people to the north, and that wasn't a brand new concept. That was something they'd be doing, we suspect, as early back here as 3000 BC. So I'm going to send these guys here. Let's just leave them there to kind of keep an eye on these fellas. As for what Chinese society was like at this point, so as I just mentioned, I mentioned the Yellow Emperor a little bit earlier, and these kind of mythical ideas of, the origins of Chinese society and Chinese culture. What we do know, going back this period, or at least we have very healthy guesses, are that the Chinese culture was quite similar to what would come a little bit later on, which is to say lots of shamanism going on, animism, lots of ancestor worship, which is this common thing that's happening again and again in Chinese society. I picked writing a minute ago in a kind of a role-playing decision for research because, of course, the Chinese, discovered writing quite early. And the earliest forms of Chinese writing came in what we call seal scripts, which were basically put on kind of bits of pottery and tombs and things like that for people who had died. And we also have, in terms of our first extant records ever of Chinese life, we have what we call the oracle bones, which was shamans would take these, the bones of animals, and they would heat them up, right? And they would crack them. And then the shamans, at least, claimed that if they were to, that they could read the cracks in the bones and that they could tell the future with it. And so they'd say, oh, it's going to be a good harvest next year, or you should wage war on your neighbor this year, it's a good year to do it, etc., etc. And we kind of have Hi everyone, so it seems like it hasn't been my day at all. I've had all kinds of problems. But I'm back. I'm going to do another 15 minutes or so. I think I lost everyone that was here for the first section. And for people watching the archive, it will seem odd, but what happened was my computer suddenly crashed. I got a very weird light blue screen of death, which is kind of a new concept for me. I guess that's a Windows 10 thing. But I'm going to go ahead. Not a lot had happened, so I started up another China game, and I'm just going to go ahead and just kind of, go back to what I was talking about, so we didn't really miss much. I was talking about at the end of the most previous clip, about seal scripts and oracle bones, and so kind of the earliest historical source we have for the Chinese are oracle bones, where these shamans essentially, they heated up the bones of animals and they would crack them, and then you could tell from the cracks, at least this is what they said, you could tell from the cracks what was going to happen in the future, or what was happening, in the world, or whatever it was. And this is kind of the center of Chinese religion. What I wanted to talk about, because I said in the last section, I mentioned that, we don't, although we have the Yellow Emperor and we have various myths and oral tales and everything else, What we do know about this period is in terms of Chinese religion, a lot of shamanism, which is very common, of course, human development during that time. Connections to kind of the real world and the spiritual, the idea that, earthquakes and typhoons, other natural disasters could be linked directly to human behavior, or as may have it, human misbehavior, which is an important idea which really sticks with the Chinese for a very long time. And when I eventually get to the first millennium BC, I'll talk about Confucius, and I'll talk about the importance those ideas had for Confucius, and the importance that he certainly ascribed to that. So I'll talk about that in the future too. But certainly at this time, we know that there's shamanism. There's a certain amount of worship going on of of mountains and hills and all this kind of stuff. So a lot of that going on, and also ancestor worship. And we know that there's been ancestor worship for pretty much as long as there kind of been identifiably Chinese people culturally. And of course, that's something the Chinese people still practice in today. And they still practice ancestor worship today, although in kind of a different kind of manner, and different kind of ways, of course. And we'll talk more about that in future episodes. So I'm going to try and catch up to where I was, because one thing I didn't talk about in the last clip just now that got cut off, that I would like to talk about, is one of the challenges you have for Civ 5 is, and all Civilization games, of course, is the anachronism issue, right? So this is something people talk about all the time. So a common example, especially if, like me, you like to play slightly easier levels so you can kind of get to the tech faster, you end up with, a nuclear weapon that is, and you're taking out chariots, right? Or whatever the case may be. And this is kind of both a weakness for Civilization 5, but arguably part of its appeal. So when I had my students play a game of Civ 5, I specifically, in January as part of my class, while I was at a conference, I specifically told them that I wanted them to think about the ways in which Civ 5 went against what we know actually happened. And there's not a good kind of conversation out there about the fact that, if anything, this is a good example of what games can do, that they allow you to be ahistorical, that they push you to be ahistorical, the idea that there's something to be gained from the fact that if you literally just, I'm kind of trying to play this kind of role-playingly, like, to somehow kind of approximate what happened in Chinese history, but in practice, if I had a history book in front of me, and all of my decisions had to be made according to the book that was in front of me, I might find that interesting, because I teach history for a living, and I write about history for a living, but that's not really what you expect from a game. And so it's kind of an intriguing element to what Civ does, and the extent to which that's a good thing. Another example, of course, is the continuing anachronisms is 3460 BC. At least for me, I don't know if you guys have the same experience. I tend to developing writing now, and I'll have writing, I think, before the beginning of the third millennium BC, which is a bit ahead of time, but I will then struggle to kind of catch up, and so I kind of always feel weird, like I don't have the steam engine by 1850 and all these kinds of things that will happen in the game. But that'll get fun later. Something to talk about, I guess, the way that every Civ game starts, you have this relative isolation, right? There's nobody really that's near me. I did pick a huge world, which helped. But there's a limited amount of interaction with other kind of groups, with other civs, I guess you could say. In the previous clip, we had some interaction with some barbarians, and I talked a little bit about kind of the the Chinese having to deal with that kind of a thing. But there's not much in the way of having to deal with large relations with other peoples. And a lot of what's going on here is between different Chinese groups. And so this translates into, for example, rivalries over who controls what kind of section of land and who controls what comes to be known as China. One of the interesting things about Chinese history is that fairly early on, people essentially agree that there is a China. There is this kind of single political entity that they want to control, that they want to fight over, and particularly the Age of Warring States in the kind of last few hundred years of the millennium before the time of Christ, or before the opening of the Common Era. These are marked by warfare between people who are basically competing to control China. At least China is kind of we would know it, and so that in itself is interesting. But I always find the rhythm of Civ games is quite intriguing. So I kind of mentioned earlier, you have this sense of before you know it, you're micromanaging, you're trying to fight, you're doing all these kinds of things. But the opening to a Civ game is kind of relaxed in pace, which I kind of find interesting, and you're kind of free to experiment and to play around with who your civ is going to be. Let me save this in case my computer crashes again, because that really sucked, and I don't want that to happen again. It's the short version. I'm just gonna save, just as long as it saves, I don't care, and return to game. So choose production, and I'm gonna go for a granary to try and grow, because I have my settlers, and let's send them up here to the recommended spot. I'm a sucker for these recommended spots. Oh, major defeat. Let's do the civilized thing and just run away. Run away and fight another day. So we've crossed over into the 3rd millennium BC. We are now officially, in the period where allegedly the Yellow Emperor lived. And he was one of several. I'm really tempted to get philosophy, but we'll get to that later. Let's pick something slightly more practical for now. Archery takes us to mathematics. Let's take archery. The Yellow Emperor was one of several historical figures. He wasn't the only one. He's kind of the most prominent one. And there developed a cult of the Yellow Emperor much later on in the 1st century AD, and this sense of this kind of figure that must have been the creative force behind what people understood to be Chinese civilization and Chinese culture. We can really start talking about clear evidence of what we could call dynastic type civilizations in the certainly by 1500 BC, and in truth probably a couple hundred years before that. But that's really the limits of it. I mean, anything past that, and you're starting to get a bit generous with what you call a civilization. You're including oral history, you're including mythology, including all these kinds of things. So, it looks like my warriors are out. You know what? I thought they put a pretty good shift in there. Did a nice job exploring the eastern coast of whatever this is in the supposed world map. So, so you have this idea of civilization, whatever the heck that kind of means, and the earliest Chinese civilizations, we know they had ancestor worship, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. We know, thanks to some archaeological digs, some of them as late as the 1970s, that there were elites, that China was fairly hierarchical, the Chinese social organization was fairly hierarchical, and that some elite people, I should say, had themselves buried with courtiers, in some cases possibly alive. And so we know that the Chinese had this concept of the afterlife that would stick with them for a very long time, and this idea of when you die, you're kind of still around, so you're not with us, you're in a different kind of plane of existence. But rather than moving on to heaven, as for example you do in kind of hopefully in the Christian worldview, in the Chinese worldview, you kind of stick around. You're kind of present. You're in the afterlife, which is both here and not here, and so you can interact with other ghosts, and your family can take care of you. And that's the central premise of ancestor worship. So it's this idea that you can buy special kinds of money and you can burn it and offer it to the ancestors. There's all these things that you can do, and it is based heavily in this idea of respect for your parents, but it's also based in this idea of they're there and they need you to help them, they need you to support them. I'm going to name the second city Chang'an, which isn't particularly more historically accurate than naming the first one Xi'an. Chang'an was the capital of the Tang dynasty. I'll probably give in soon and call the city Beijing, but for now I'm going to go ahead and try and pick these, in theory, more authentic names. I suppose it would have made sense to build a warrior or a scout or something, seeing as I've nothing to do now. I'll have to do that next. Oh dear. So here come the barbarians, and as I said, before, unfortunately, my computer crashed. Like this is actually, certainly in the Chinese context, this was just a constant threat. We know that for a long time the Chinese had to deal with this kind of problem, and they would buy them off where they could. So a lot of the time, they give them precious goods, they trade goods, they would occasionally basically, hand over a daughter. I probably need to go ahead and change this from a granary to I could probably purchase something. They would marry off a daughter sometimes to these chieftain leaders. So they're really kind of pragmatic, and they kind of had to be. So something that the Chinese are doing early on is they're growing a lot of agricultural a lot of agricultural culture there. Obviously, they're growing a lot of crops. In the north, they're growing wheat. In the south, they're growing rice. And that puts them at a disadvantage against the barbarians, who tend to be mobile, and particularly as they become more horse based. But for the Chinese, over time, of course, it ends up with these larger cities, larger armies, larger populations, you name it. All my advisors want me to get sailing. What does sailing give me? Boats, basically. I'm going to get the calendar, because I just feel like being contrarian. So this is a fairly accurate representation, and again, I suppose, talking about the theme of Civ 5 and Civ games, of starting you off with this kind of idea of being isolated and slowly taking your time. The kind of opposition to this, of course, would be various kind of groups of people who are, out there to get you. In particular for the Chinese, depending again on how you kind of choose to date it, they have a civilization pretty early. So, for example, if you look at Korea, at this time, you're looking at a community that is largely dominated by chieftain groups, by clan groups, by groups like that. They're not nomadic per se. I mean, some of them are, but they're not nomadic in the way that the Mongolians are. But that's just the way the kind of life is in Korea. And in Japan, it's very similar. So China really stands out as having this civilization early on. So when you hear these kind of sometimes rather trite, sometimes overly simplistic kind of statements that China, oldest culture on the planet and stuff, there is a core of truth to that, and especially when you compare it to their neighbors and other civilizations globally, the Chinese really are exhibiting a lot of these features very, very early on. The downside, of course, to this is we're kind of waiting for stuff to happen a little bit so that I can talk about it. I'd really love to talk about Confucius, for example, and talk about some of those things, but I feel like it's kind of hard to, if I bring it up now, what am I going to talk about when we get to 300 BC? Although, of course, as we mentioned, I'm sure that the game will find a way to jump me across to the Middle Ages as quickly as it can. So again, the fun thing about the Civ 5 world map is we have no idea what part of the world we're in. I'm not sure. I'm trying to guess here from the kind of the contours of this earth here. I'm not entirely sure. I'm going to fortify until healed. So yeah, well, there's not a lot happening now, so I think I'm going to call it a day, guys. Really appreciate those of you who are kind of watching in now. It's really appreciated. I'm terribly sorry that I crashed. For those of you who hung in for both videos, really appreciate that. You're troopers. I'm going to come back either tomorrow or Thursday at roughly the same time to do some casting. You can find us at historyrespawn.com if you're not already familiar with us. Subscribe to us on YouTube. That's our main channel. You can find us at History Respawn, no ED on the end, at Twitter. And I'm on Twitter as @ProfJohnHarney, and we'll fire out a couple of updates on when the live streams are going to come. Otherwise, again, really appreciate you tuning in, and I hope you tune in the future. And we like this idea of kind of a change of pace from our standard interviews with historians. Certainly, if you've happened to come across, you're not entirely sure what the heck is going on, who is this guy, why is he talking about history, definitely please check out our channel. I really do think you'll like it. We've got some very, very cool interviews there. We recently posted Red Dead Redemption, was the last one, and it was great. And we have another one coming up in about 2 weeks, the next episode, which we're quite excited about. So please consider having a look. Anyway, listen, until next time, goodbye, and thanks so much for joining me this evening.